I never thought grief and betrayal could collide so violently, but life has a way of wounding you in places you didn't even know were still raw. My name is Anna. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I believed that loyalty at work still meant something. I thought that if you gave your heart and years of your life to a place, they'd at least treat you with the smallest shred of decency when tragedy knocked at your door. But I was wrong. It started with my father's death. He was 72, stubborn as oak, the kind of man who lived through hard winters and tougher years, without ever asking for much. When the call came that he was gone, I felt something inside me collapse, like the foundation I'd been standing on all my life had suddenly given way. My father wasn't perfect. No parent ever is, but he was mine. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, the one who waited in his truck when I went to prom, the one who always slipped me $20 bills for emergencies even when I was grown. Losing him was losing my anchor. I went to my boss the very next morning. My eyes were swollen from crying, my hands trembling as I held the leave request form. I remember standing there in his office, my voice so small when I said, "It's my father. He passed away yesterday. I'll need 3 days for the funeral." He looked at me, barely lifting his gaze from the screen, and simply said, "Of course. Take the time you need. Family comes first." His words felt like a small mercy in a storm I wasn't ready for. I believed him. Those 3 days passed in a blur of flowers and condolences of relatives I hadn't seen in years, offering awkward hugs of standing at the graveside with the cold wind cutting through my black dress. My mother leaned on me so heavily I thought we'd both fall into the ground with him. I don't remember much else, only the sound of dirt hitting the coffin, heavy and final. By the time it was over, I felt hollow, like I had poured out every last piece of myself just to keep standing. When I returned to work on Monday, still carrying the weight of my father's absence, I expected quiet nods, maybe a few sympathetic glances. Instead, I was summoned to HR before I even sat down at my desk. I thought maybe it was routine paperwork, some formality tied to my leave. But when I walked into that sterile white office and saw the folder on the desk, my stomach dropped. I knew that folder. Everyone did. It was the folder they only brought out when your career was about to end. Anna, the HR manager, said, her voice too rehearsed, too smooth. "Your position with the company has been terminated, effective immediately." I couldn't process it at first. I blinked at her, certain she had misspoken. Terminated for what? My voice cracked on the word. "Your attendance record has been flagged," she replied mechanically, as if reading from a script. "The 3 days you took last week were considered unexcused." I felt the air leave my lungs. Unexcused. But my boss approved my leave. He said family comes first. She looked away, then her eyes darting toward the folder, as if the papers inside might shield her from my disbelief. "There's nothing I can do. The decision has already been finalized." I walked out of that office in a haze, my legs trembling, my throat burning with words I couldn't speak. I passed my co-workers' desks, their eyes following me, some with pity, others with curiosity, all of them silent. No one dared to say anything. It was as if I had become invisible, erased in real time before their eyes. I gathered my things from my desk, the framed photo of my parents at their 50th anniversary, the mug my father had given me that said "World's Okayest Daughter," the stack of sticky notes covered in my messy handwriting. I placed them in a cardboard box, each item feeling heavier than it should, as though grief had soaked into them too. By the time I reached the parking lot, tears blurred my vision so completely I could barely find my car. I sat there for what felt like hours, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, my father's photo staring back at me as if to say, "Don't let them do this to you." And something inside me shifted. Beneath the grief, beneath the disbelief, a slow, burning anger began to rise. I had given this company years of my life, stayed late nights when no one else would, sacrifice weekends, put my own needs second, because I thought loyalty mattered, and they had discarded me like trash. Worse than that, they had used my father's death, my rawest wound, as the knife to cut me loose. I wiped my face with shaking hands, the tears turning hot, not from sadness, but from rage. I thought of my boss's words, the lie he told me so casually, "Family comes first." No. To him, the company came first. Profits came first. I had never really mattered, not as a person, not as a daughter grieving her father. And for the first time in my life, I knew I couldn't just accept it. I couldn't just walk away and let this betrayal stand. The email arrived like a blade across my chest. Cold, impersonal, heartless. Clear your desk by the end of the day, Holly. Human Resources will handle the exit paperwork. I read it twice, then a third time, the words swimming on my computer screen until they blurred into nothing but betrayal. 5 years of my life at Summit Edge Logistics gone in a single paragraph, typed by someone who didn't even have the decency to face me. 3 days. That's all I had taken. 3 days to bury my father. 3 days of leave that had been approved by my direct supervisor, Dan Weaver. 3 days of standing beside my grieving mother, of lowering the man who had taught me patience and strength into the earth. And now, for daring to choose family over quarterly reports, I was being erased. My name is Holly Peterson, 34 years old, regional team lead at the highest performing division of this company, or at least I was until 2 minutes ago. I had poured not just my skills but my soul into building this team. We weren't just coworkers. We were family. Birthdays celebrated together, weekends spent rescuing projects that should have collapsed, late nights leaning on each other's shoulders. And in return, I was discarded like my father's death was nothing but an inconvenience. I sat back in my chair, the leather squeaking beneath me, the dawn light just beginning to bleed into the Boise office. It was still early quiet, the world not yet awake. I could have screamed. I could have stormed into Dan's office and demanded an explanation. But instead, I did something else. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photograph of the email, and forwarded it to my personal account. Documentation. Evidence. A habit my father had instilled in me long before I knew why it mattered. Then quietly, methodically, I began to pack my things. By the time my colleagues started arriving, half my desk was cleared. Tanya from accounting was the first to notice. Her eyes widened as she glanced at the cardboard box. "Holly, what's happening?" she whispered. I forced my voice to stay calm. "I've been let go." "What, why?" I swallowed hard. Apparently, attending my father's funeral showed I didn't prioritize work. Her face shifted from shock to fury. "That's not right. Have you told Paula the regional manager would—" "No," I interrupted gently, wrapping the little cactus my team had given me for Christmas. "I'm not going to fight it, but I won't forget it either." One by one, the rest of my team arrived. Jason, my cheerful logistics specialist, froze mid-step when he saw the box. His grin vanished. "This is bull." "It's done," I cut him off softly. "Dan made his decision. But you carried the Newbrook merger last month. Profits are up 18% because of your planning." Jason's voice cracked with disbelief. I smiled sadly. Apparently that wasn't enough. By 9:30, all 7 of my core team members had gathered around me: Jason, Veronica, Ethan, Louise, Diane, Gabriella, and Kayla. Their eyes carried disbelief, anger, and grief. Veronica, our client relations manager, openly cried. Ethan, who rarely showed emotion, looked like he wanted to punch the nearest wall. "You can't leave," Veronica said desperately. "The Wilson account is up for renewal next week. The Hernandez contract is still in negotiations. No one knows the systems like you do." I taped the box shut with steady hands. Dan should have thought of that before firing me for going to my father's funeral. The words tasted like ash, but saying them out loud gave me a strange, quiet strength. That was when his voice sliced through the air. "I need everyone back at their desks. Now!" Dan Weaver stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of disdain. The room stilled. My team hesitated, unwilling to abandon me. Dan's voice rose sharper. "Now." Reluctantly, they dispersed, but not before giving me looks I'll never forget: loyalty, sorrow, anger, respect. Dan approached me as the room emptied, lowering his voice. "This could have been handled with more discretion if you'd waited until the end of the day." I looked him straight in the eyes. "Like the discretion you showed when you fired me by email after approving my bereavement leave." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he straightened his tie, his jaw tightening. "Business needs change rapidly. Summit Edge needs people who understand shifting priorities. Your father's passing was unfortunate, but—" "Don't," I cut in, my voice deadly quiet. "Don't finish that sentence." He flinched just barely before gesturing toward HR. "They're expecting you." I picked up my box, holding it firmly. "Don't worry, Dan. I won't make a scene. But remember this moment. You might find it important later. The HR office was sterile, the walls white and lifeless, the air thick with polite falseness. Barbara Kent, the HR officer, gave me a look of sympathy she couldn't quite disguise. She was new, still human enough to feel discomfort in situations like this. She slid the paperwork across the desk. I'm sorry about this, Holly, and I'm deeply sorry about your father. Thank you, I murmured, scanning the documents. 2 weeks severance, a non-disparagement clause, a reminder of my 6-month non-compete. They wanted me silent, they wanted me gone. Barbara hesitated. Off the record, this isn't right. If you wanted to pursue action, I said, firmly, signing, but thank you. When I walked out, eyes followed me from cubicles and hallways. Some filled with pity, others with admiration, a few with fear. I smiled at my team one last time, my final act as their leader. Outside, the September air was unseasonably warm. I placed the box in my trunk, then sat in the driver's seat staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My phone buzzed with messages. Jason, Veronica, Ethan. This is wrong. Are you okay? We're furious. My hands shook, but not from grief anymore. I thought of my father standing with me in the river teaching me patience. The river moves, Holly girl, but the rocks stay steady. Be like the rocks. And I knew then I wouldn't fight them directly. Not yet. I wouldn't scream or beg. I would wait. I would plan. Because rivers carve canyons over time, and I had no intention of being washed away. I drove without music, letting the thrum of the tires be the only sound as my phone kept lighting up with messages I didn't yet have the strength to answer. At a red light, I reread the termination email, then forwarded it to my personal account again, as if duplication could make reality less fragile. By the time the sun slid higher over the foothills, a different kind of clarity began to settle. Grief had cracked me open. Anger poured in. Discipline was what would keep me upright. I remembered my father's hands, steady on the fishing rod, his voice telling me to feel the river through the line and not to yank at every tremor. Wait, he always said. Set the hook at the right moment and only once. When my phone rang with a number I recognized from old conference lanyards and polite industry emails, I let it go to voicemail, listened, then called back. The voice on the other end carried a warmth I hadn't felt in days. He'd heard I might be in transition and wondered if I had time to talk about opportunities. I told him I had time now. Within the hour, I was walking through glass doors that opened onto a space the opposite of what I had just left, light pooling across open work areas, laughter spilling from a corner whiteboard session, a receptionist who looked me in the eye like I was human. I sat across from a man with a silver beard and shrewd, kind eyes who said he'd followed my team's numbers for months and was impressed. He asked me to tell him the real story. I did not to weaponize my pain but to set the record straight. He winced when I described the email, and he said something simple that unlocked the breath in my chest. What happened to you is wrong, and we treat wrong things as opportunities to hire people who deserve better. He talked about a division. They were building a map that sketched the Pacific Northwest like a promise. A role that would give me the authority to lead, without apologizing for leading. He said the title and the pay out loud, as if they weren't secrets. I asked about my non-compete, that vague net employers throw, after you've already been pushed overboard. He smiled in a way that told me he had already asked the question I was asking now. His legal team, he said, had read my agreement and believed it was too broad to survive daylight. They would back me if there was a fight. He told me to take the weekend before deciding. I told him I appreciated the respect implied by time. That evening, in a dim booth near the river, where the tourists rarely wandered, I met 2 of my people. Their faces, usually so quick to joke, were tight around the mouth. Their eyes kept sliding to my hands as if to make sure they were not empty. We ordered waters we barely touched. I told them I was all right in the way the newly injured define all right as still breathing. They told me the office felt like a building where the sprinklers had gone off, but no one had bothered to sweep out the water. Files misplaced, clients asking where I was, deadlines breathing down necks that had never felt that cold before. They asked what I was going to do, and I said I had an option I was weighing, and that any choice I made would be made with care. They nodded like they had already guessed. When they stood to leave, one of them squeezed my shoulder and said that leadership was not a title, it was a person, and that where I went would define whether they felt led. I didn't cry until I was alone in my car. Saturday morning, I sat across from a lawyer whose office smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. He read. He underlined. He shook his head at clauses that pretended to be reasonable while circling like sharks. He explained the landscape in calm, measured sentences. At will could be cruel, but courts also frowned on contracts that handcuffed the fired. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted to work, to build, to lead, to do it without crawling back to the people who had chosen convenience over decency. He told me I could do that. He said to keep records, to keep my tone clean, to let my results talk louder than my resentment. I thanked him and left feeling taller by a fraction of an inch. On Sunday, I stood in my kitchen holding my father's mug, the one that called me an okayest daughter, with a kind of affection that always made me laugh, and scrolled through a week's worth of photos I had never posted. My team crowded around a spreadsheet on the break room table. Veronica's pen tucked behind her ear. Jason grinning at a graph like it was a magic trick. Little victories that added up to a culture. I understood then that the most dangerous thing I could take from Summit Edge wasn't a single client or proprietary method. It was the gravity of a leader who refuses to abandon her principles. Gravity is invisible until you step away from it and feel the drift. Monday morning, I called the man with the silver beard and said yes, but also said only if. I wanted to build my own team. I told him not by raiding out of spite, but by opening doors for the people who had been told the doors were ornamental. He didn't hesitate. He said that if my people were half as good as their quarterly numbers suggested, he wanted them yesterday. I emailed 7 referrals with the same quiet sentence: if you're ready, here's where you can apply. There will be no pressure from me, only a promise that you will be evaluated fairly. Within hours, confirmations pinged my inbox. They were ready. In the afternoon, I signed a contract with a pen that didn't shake. The next morning, as the sun slipped over the ridge and turned the river to molten glass, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen since the day before my grief made me an inconvenience. The regional manager's voice tried for calm and landed on brittle. She said she'd just received 7 resignation letters, all effective immediately, all from one team. She wanted to know if I had anything to do with it. I looked out the window at the light moving across the water and thought about rocks and current, and how influence is simply what remains when you've done your work with integrity long enough. I told her people make choices that align with how they want to be treated, and then I let the silence do what it does best. Her silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I could almost hear her chewing it bitter as aspirin. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted, less brittle, more pleading. Holly, this could damage Summit Edge. Is that really what you want, to burn it down? I stared at the river outside my window, its steady current unbothered by her desperation. I didn't set the fire, I said quietly. You did, the moment you treated grief like disobedience. I hung up before she could answer. For the first time since that awful email, my hands were still. That week was a blur of new beginnings. The office that welcomed me had a raw energy, the kind that feels like possibility instead of exhaustion. There was no cold edge of fear in people's eyes when management walked by. Laughter spilled more easily. Ideas weren't strangled by bureaucracy. When my 7 walked in, Jason, Veronica, Ethan, Louise, Diane, Gabriella, and Kayla, they carried both relief and determination. Each had endured whispers, raised eyebrows, subtle threats before handing in their resignations, but they had chosen integrity over comfort. And now, as they set their mugs on new desks and pinned up photos of children and partners, I felt a swell of pride so fierce it almost knocked me back. We hit the ground running. Our first assignment was a contract Summit Edge had neglected, one of those accounts they treated like background noise while chasing flashier wins. We nurtured it, listened, built something stronger than what existed before. Within a month, revenues doubled. Within 2, we'd secured 3 more accounts, all through word of mouth from clients who felt the difference in how we worked. The numbers spoke loudly, but what spoke louder was the way my team walked through the office, shoulders squared, laughter in their throats, their worth no longer questioned. Still, word from the old building reached us like echoes from a collapsing house. Deadlines missed, clients restless, staff overworked and undersupported. Dan had been promoted in name but stripped of authority in practice. He had the title but no trust. And then came the call from Tanya late one evening, her voice hushed. "You won't believe this," she whispered. "Summit Edge is losing Hernandez. They're pulling the contract and going to you." I sat down hard in my chair, the weight of it settling in my chest. Hernandez had been the account Dan used to boast about, the one he said proved his leadership. And now, by nothing more than consequence and character, it had slipped through his fingers and landed in mine. Karma, it seemed, kept its own calendar. But revenge wasn't the word I carried in my heart. It wasn't about watching them drown. It was about proving to myself and to every person who had ever been told their humanity was an inconvenience that decency and discipline could win. Months passed, and the pattern repeated. Clients we had once saved under Summit Edge found their way back to us. My team grew, our office expanding into new wings, the energy multiplying instead of fading. At night, when the building quieted and I was the last one out, I sometimes walked the halls in awe. Not at the growth, but at the resilience that had bloomed out of betrayal. Then came the morning when I opened the paper and saw the headline, "Summit Edge Logistics Faces Class Action Lawsuit Over Wrongful Terminations and Workplace Misconduct." My breath caught. Beneath the headline was a list of names. Mine was one of them. Someone had filed on my behalf. Tanya later admitted it was her idea, joined by others who had been pushed out like me. They'd gathered their evidence, their stories, and a law firm had taken the case. For the first time since losing my father, I let myself cry freely, not from sorrow, but from something else. Vindication. The river had carved its canyon. I drove to the cemetery that afternoon, the wind cutting across the stones, the sky heavy with autumn clouds. I knelt by my father's grave, brushing the leaves from his name. "You were right, Dad," I whispered. "The rocks stay steady." I didn't break, and neither did the people who believed in me. The breeze stirred a low hum through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice again. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed with another message, this one from a recruiter who had once overlooked me, now eager to talk. I smiled to myself, sliding the phone back into my pocket. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I already had it in the eyes of my team and the clients who trusted us, in the mirror, where I finally saw not just survival, but strength. And if there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about revenge or even justice. It's about choice. The choice to stay silent or to speak, to collapse or to rise, to let betrayal define you or to carve your own path through the current. So if you're listening to this, if you've been discarded, overlooked, or told your grief makes you less valuable, remember, you are not disposable. You are the rock in the river, steady, unshakable, and in time the current will prove it. If my story has touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your own stories of resilience, of moments you refused to be broken. Together we can remind the world that integrity is worth more than convenience.